Today we're going to talk about chapter 11 of To Kill a Mockingbird. It is a chapter where the kids learn a lot of life lessons when dealing with Mrs. DeBose, the mean neighbor. Um, Chapter 11 starts off where Scout is in the second grade now, so a couple years later, and they are always walking by Mrs. DeBose's house, and especially on their way to walk by Boo Radley's because they're still infatuated with Boo Radley and the Radleys. Mrs. DeBose lived by herself. She was a mean, old, sick lady, and she did have a Negro girl who was her servant or her helper or her nurse, however you want to kind of think about it. Jim and Scout had a distaste for Mrs. DeBose. They did not like her. Every time they walked by and say, "Hey, Mrs. DeBose, good morning, how are you?" She would always say something negative, like, "Dude, does your dad know you guys are walking by?" And they would be like, "Well, yeah, it's Saturday. It's okay. We've been doing this for years." And she would just say something that's not very nice. So Atticus would say that she's an old lady and she's very sick, and so that they should give her grace. And the kids have a hard time understanding why they should still be nice to her, regardless of the things that she would do. Jim would argue and be like, "She doesn't seem very sick because she can scream at us and yell at us from her porch." And Atticus just says, "Kill her with kindness," and he models the behavior by saying, "Mrs. DeBose, you look like a picture this evening, and how are you doing?" And so Scout and Jim are expected to act the same way. After Jim turned 12, him and Scout were walking to town, and he wanted to buy with his birthday money a miniature steam engine and for him, and then he had some extra, so he decided to buy a twirling baton for Scout, and it's something that she had her eye on and she wanted. So I think we see here that Jim has learned to be very giving and nice to his sister, even though sometimes, siblings can bicker and have some issues. But she was on the porch, Mrs. DeBose, when they walked by after they got their new toys, and she's giving them a hard time again, and so they go ahead and practice what Atticus taught them, and they're very nice to her, and she's saying that they're liars and that they're contradicting her and all kinds of stuff. So eventually she goes on to say that they're not going to amount to anything, and Jim whispers to Scout, "Come on, don't pay attention to her. Just hold your head high like Atticus taught you and be a gentleman," which is funny because he meant to say a lady, right? Because Atticus always tells him to be a gentleman, but he tells Scout to be a gentleman. But anyway, then Mrs. DeBose said to them that not only a Finch waiting tables, talking about Scout, that's kind of her future, was waiting tables and nothing more, but also that the Finch's law for N-words. And so this is the first chapter that we see the N-word a lot. And I always, if you're teaching students or reading it with young people, I always mention like, hey, we're going to see the N-word. And remember, it is very acceptable during this time period. It is not great. It definitely became more negative over time, and you'll see that. But I always use the word N-word when I talk about it because I want you to know what it is, and I want the people that read it to see why it was used and how it was used and why we don't do it anymore. But anyway, Mrs. DeBose says that, the family laws for N-words, and then she goes on to say that Atticus is no better than the N-words that he works for. And Jim and Scout are starting to get mad. Scout says that she's pretty used to hearing all these insults aimed at Atticus, right? He is a lawyer, and but this is the first time from an adult. Usually she hears it from kids at the playground and at school, but now she's hearing it from her neighbor, and the neighbor that is only treated with kindness from Atticus, so she's definitely upset. Jim went ahead and bought the steam engine and the baton, and I think all of that stewed for a few days. And the next time he walks by Mrs. DeBose's house, she's not outside, and he decides to destroy all of her flowers. He takes the baton from Scout and he whacks them until there's none left because he's so mad about all of the comments that Mrs. DeBose says about Atticus. He seems to be able to take any of the comments and negative talk that she gives to them, but when it's about Atticus, it's a different story. So he takes the baton, kills all of her flowers, and then he takes it and he breaks it on his knee. And then of course Scout is very upset and she's crying and she doesn't understand. And when they get home, they decide not to wait for Atticus because, of course, he did something wrong. And so they go in the house and they're with Calpurnia, and she's treating him like she knows what happened, but she doesn't say anything to him. She just kicks him out of the kitchen, and they wait for Atticus to get home. And Scout knows that he's upset. And even though he, broke her baton, which he bought for her, she tries to make him feel better. And she's like, hey, this looks like you. And he doesn't want to talk, and he's quiet, and he doesn't look at her. And so finally Atticus comes home, and Atticus says, are you responsible for this, Jim? And he said, yes, sir. He owns up to it. He's very respectable. I think he gets those traits from Atticus. Atticus does a good job of, teaching his kids how he wants them to act. And then he asks him, like, why would you do this? Why did you kill all of her flowers? And why did this happen? And Jim said, well, she said that you lawed for N-words and trash. And then Atticus goes on and he says, I have no doubt that you've been annoyed by people and you're going to hear things about me lawing for N-words, as you say, but I strongly advise you to go down there and talk to Mrs. DuBose because it's unacceptable behavior. And so, he argues a little bit, but eventually he goes on out the door. And then when he leaves to go say sorry to Mrs. DuBose, Scout and him are sitting in the chair and they're reading like normal, and she goes, for the life of me, I just can't understand why you would send him back there. He's probably going to get shot or, something. She's not a nice person, and you're basically just sending him to his death by sending him out there by himself. And why would you do that for Jim when he was sticking up for you? And so he kind of chuckles and he says, it's not time to worry yet. But he also says that he thought it would be her that he would have to worry about and not Jim. He's used to Jim being able to hold his head, and lately it's kind of been the opposite. And so he's a little surprised by that. And then he does tell her, when summer comes, then you're really going to have to worry about things. They're going to get a lot worse. And so this is Atticus kind of foreshadowing that the worst is yet to come, especially with this trial and Tom Robinson. He says that the case with Tom Robinson is something that goes to the essence of a man's conscience. And he couldn't go to church or worship God if he didn't try his best to help Tom. And it's just the right thing to do. And so he's trying to teach Scout a lesson here. And then, he says people are certainly entitled to think what they want, but this is what I think is right. And then Jim comes back and he says, I'm back. And he says, well, son, what happened? And he goes, I cleaned it up for her and I said I was sorry, but I ain't sorry. And that he would start working on them on Saturdays until they grew back. And Atticus says, well, you shouldn't say sorry if you're not sorry. And eventually he goes, she also wants me to read to her. And then Atticus says, well, you'll have to do it for a month then. And so he grumbles about it, and eventually he says, okay. So Monday afternoon, Jim goes to the front steps of Mrs. DuBose's house, and Scout tags along. I think she's there for support, which is not really anything that she says, but it's definitely implied in this chapter. But they go there, and they come in, and of course she's kind of not very nice to them, and she says stuff like, you brought your dirty little sister, when they show up at the door, and he stands up for her and he just says, she's not dirty and I ain't scared of you, is what he says. And so he's being tough and he's being kind of professional still, and he's not calling her mean names or anything. He's just standing his ground. And he goes on to say about how horrible she is. She looks terrible. She definitely looks ill. She's in a bed, and he decides to read Ivanhoe to her. He begins reading, and they weren't there very long, like 15 minutes, and an alarm clock goes off, and she tells them to go home. And so they're home before Atticus, and it wasn't that bad. And when Atticus comes home, he said, did she scare you? And of course Jim says, no, she didn't scare me, but she's really nasty. And then Scout says, she scared me. And he goes on to talk about, how she's sick, and that then Scout asks the question, what is an inward lover? And Atticus says, have you been hearing this, Scout? And she said, no, but that's what Mrs. DuBose calls you, an inward lover, and I just don't know what it is. And so he said, an inward lover is just one of those terms that doesn't mean anything. It kind of is something like snot nose. There's not really a point to it, and it's hard to explain. Trashy people use it, he says. So he tries to tell his kids that it's not a bad word, but it's just not something that we should use. And so then he goes, Scout goes, "You're not really an inward lover then, are you, Atticus?" And he goes, "I absolutely am." He says, "I do my best to love everyone." And I think that this is such a great lesson that the kids learn. He said, sometimes it's hard to do, but it's never an insult to call somebody something, or to think that it's a bad name, because it just shows that the poor person, it doesn't really hurt you. So don't let them see that you're upset by it. A few minutes later, they go on to talk about it, and they realize that each day that Jim has been reading to Mrs. DeBose, that the time they spend there gets longer. The alarm clock gets longer, and each day they're spending a little bit more time. And so finally, Jim says, "Can I be done?" And Atticus says, "Just one more week, son." So one more week goes by, and it's the last day, and Mrs. DeBose says, "That's it. That will do. Thank you. And get out of here." And eventually, Atticus says, "I'm going down to Mrs. DeBose's for a while," like a day later. And when he gets back, the kids say, "What did she want?" And he said, "She's dead." So Mrs. DeBose died, and they find out that she was a morphine addict, which is why the alarm clock was going off, and she would take her medicine. And she wanted to break herself of the habit before she died. And she knew she only had a couple of months left, and Atticus was helping her with her will. And so each day, the kids reading to her helped her break her addiction of morphine before she died. And so Jim asked Atticus if she died free, and Atticus said, "As free as the mountain air." So yes, she did, and it was because of you guys. And then he gave Jim a box, and inside of it was a cotton white, waxy, perfect camellia, like the ones that he destroyed in her front yard. And it was snow on the mountain, so super white and beautiful. And Jim kind of got upset, and he kind of used a curse word. And then Atticus says it's basically her way of telling you that everything is going to be all right. And then Atticus says something that is kind of shocking. He says, "She was a great lady. Despite her illness, despite some of her ideas, we think differently than each other. She actually was a great lady in her life." And then later on in the evening, Scout notices that Jim picked up the box and threw it in the fire. But then he picked up the camellia, and he was just fingering the white petals, contemplating everything when Scout went to bed. And that's how the chapter ends.